the GAA Museum remembers Bloody Sunday. Welcome to the 7th in our series of Mondays at the Museum playbacks. This recording is of Professor Fearghal McGarry's lecture titled An Irish Amritsar, Ireland's Revolution in Global Context, which was recorded live on Microsoft Teams. Enjoy this fascinating lecture.
It's a great pleasure to be invited to be part of this lecture series, which commemorates a very important event. I just wish that I could be in Croke Park Museum giving the lecture in person and also seeing the exhibition, which I know is an important one. But hopefully these things will become possible in the not too distant future. So thanks, Siobhan, and I'd like to thank also Julianne McCaig for organising the series of talks. So this lecture series has already covered many aspects of Bloody Sunday, from the assassinations of that Sunday morning to the dreadful reprisal that took place in the afternoon, and on into the legacy and representations of that legacy, which Siobhan has looked at in her lecture. And I was struck by the power of the commemoration ceremony this weekend, and particularly the way in which all 14 of the people who died at Croke Park were remembered as individuals. And I think that's a real shift in the commemoration of this event, which reflects a wider shift in how we're remembering the revolutionary period during the decade of centenaries. There's been a very kind of a democratic or egalitarian broadening out of memory. And I think one of the important things about remembering people as individuals is that it brings a diversity and complexity to the past. And we saw how the audience at the spectators at Croke Park comprised everyone from active IRA men to First World War veterans. And indeed, it's possible to have been both of these things at the one time. So in this talk, I'd like to broaden the canvas by exploring the War of Independence in a global context. And it's kind of a talk in two parts. And in the first part, I want to argue that although many of the key events of the War of Independence, including Bloody Sunday, had very important global dimensions, the way in which we write about and commemorate the War of Independence often overlooks the significance of international aspects of the conflict. So that's the sort of the big argument I want to develop in the first part of this talk. And in the second part of the talk, as the title suggests, An Irish Amritsar, I want to consider whether Bloody Sunday was an Irish Amritsar. Is it usefully described in this comparative way, as it was almost immediately described by journalists, as we can see here in newspaper headlines? And it was also described as an Irish Amritsar by Republican political activists, not least Eamon de Valera, who was in the United States when he used that description. And Amritsar, the massacre of 400 Indians by the British Indian Army in April 1919, remains one of the most notorious imperial atrocities, and it's regarded as a turning point in the history of British rule in India by Indian nationalists who would see it as a kind of a hardening of nationalism, a sense that the days of a kind of a peaceful political accommodation were over, destroyed by that one mass act of violence. And by comparing Amritsar with Bloody Sunday, I want to consider how usefully British violence in Ireland can be understood within the wider context of imperial rule and imperial violence. So that's the agenda for the second part of this talk. And my talk this evening draws on a 3-year research project which I've led at Queen's University Belfast with historians from the University of Edinburgh and Boston College, and indeed a lot of other academics and historians we've collaborated with. And if anybody wants to get a taste of what we've been looking at in our project, the publication on the left is still widely available in newsagents, and it brings together about 20 different articles which look at aspects of the Irish Revolution in their global context. And the most recent but one issue of Irish Historical Studies, the May 2020 issue, also includes some work looking which also emerges from this project. So our project, A Global History of Irish Revolution, asks two fairly basic questions. Firstly, how did international developments shape the revolution in Ireland? And secondly, what impact did the Irish Revolution have beyond the island of Ireland? And we're very interested, obviously, in the role of the Irish diaspora. You can see Valera there in the United States in the image on the left, and we immediately think of the United States as the really key kind of front in the propaganda war of the Irish Revolution. But we're also interested in other contexts, which I'm going to be exploring this evening, such as the anti-imperial and the anti-colonial connections, which were forged by Irish revolutionaries around the post-war world. We think of, for example, Paris in the first 6 months of 1919, when Irish revolutionary diplomats are trying to enter into the peace conference and forging contacts with Indian revolutionaries and Egyptians and so on. After the Paris Peace Conference winds up, a lot of these same revolutionary movements and activists find themselves rubbing shoulders in Washington and in New York and in other places which become momentarily places of global power, where the case can be made for national independence effectively on a world stage. So we're also interested in looking at those kind of anti-imperial and anti-colonial connections alongside the obvious role played by the Irish diaspora, not just in America, but indeed from Britain and throughout the British Empire, wherever Irish people migrated in large numbers. So a key question of our project then is, how best do we understand the course of the Irish Revolution? Was it largely determined by events which take place on the island? Or were events in Ireland more the outworking of a wider process that saw the redrawing of borders after the First World War, as empire gave way to national self-determination across much of Central and Eastern Europe? And I think instinctively we tend to think of the War of Independence as something that essentially occurs within Ireland, with the broader international changes, such as the destabilizing impact of the First World War, sitting a little bit fuzzily in the background. We know they're relevant, we know they're connected, but it's not always quite clear how they shape and connect to what's happening in Ireland. And I think we tend not to think of the War of Independence, certainly not in the same way as the Easter Rising, as something which is very directly rooted within wider international circumstances. And I want to suggest three reasons for why we still think about the War of Independence in maybe still a little bit of an insular context, as something that's pretty much taking place within the island. And the first reason for this is that most of the histories that have been written about the War of Independence focus, not surprisingly perhaps, but they focus on events in Ireland, or more often they focus on events within Ireland in a particular county or a particular area. So certainly for professional historians who write about the revolution, the most historiographically influential and significant books that have really set the approach for how we think about and how we study the Irish Revolution are local histories. And I think these two books here are arguably the most influential studies of the Irish Revolution. David Fitzpatrick's Politics in Irish Life, which looks at the War of Independence in County Clare, and then 20 years later, so a book written by his PhD student, Peter Hart, which looks at the IRA in County Cork. And these two books, I think, more than probably any other two studies of the Irish Revolution, set the agenda for how we think about this period of history. A second reason, I think, why we're very focused on looking at events within Ireland is because we tend to think about and to write the history of the War of Independence as primarily a political conflict. And these are just two examples of that, more or less at random. They're both very fine books. But we have, going back to Ernie O'Malley, who was a revolutionary veteran, we have the very first kind of history that was written about the War of Independence was essentially military accounts, and that has remained very much the dominant kind of literature which was produced about the revolution in the decades afterwards. And we still continue to produce lots of accounts which primarily analyze the War of Independence as a military conflict. Most of the local histories, for example, which I just talked about, detail IRA ambushes and other military aspects of the conflict in quite a lot of detail, and we've had lots of controversies reconstructing what happened at Kilmichael or other series of controversial shootings or killings, which again very much focuses on the military aspects of the conflict. But the point I want to make here is a fairly straightforward one, is that the guerrilla war strategy, while it was an important part of the overall revolutionary strategy, political mobilization through, for example, elections and the formation of a Dáil government, and then the establishment of a counter state, was more probably in conjunction with revolutionary diplomacy and propaganda. These aspects of the struggle were probably caused much more difficulties for the British government than the small numbers of fatalities inflicted against Crown forces. So I guess the point I'm making is that we should be cautious about assuming that the military aspect of the conflict is the important one by and large. A third reason why we focus perhaps too narrowly on events in Ireland is because of how we commemorate the conflict itself. And a good example of this is the 11 events identified here by the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations. So that's largely a group of historians who have advised the Irish government in identifying which particular dates and events should be commemorated by the state as part of the decade of centenaries. And as you can see here, the list includes 11 events, all of which take place in Ireland, with the possible exception of the death of Terence McSweeney, which occurs in Britain, although very significantly marked in Ireland. And so we have events such as the convening of Dáil Éireann, January 1919, Eamon de Valera's election as president, the death of Terence McSweeney, Bloody Sunday, the burning of Cork, the Government of Ireland Act, which partitioned Ireland, and the Truce of July 1921. So just to be clear about the point that I'm making here, I'm not criticizing this selection of events in any way. These were all landmark events that were pivotal to the independence struggle, and that also, for all sorts of reasons, including their impact, deserve to be commemorated. But the argument I'm making is that commemorating the War of Independence as essentially a series of events that takes place in Ireland reinforces our understanding of the independence struggle as something that's essentially determined in Ireland. And this can make it difficult to appreciate the extent to which global forces shaped revolutionary violence and shaped the course of the Irish Revolution more generally. So I just want to take a few minutes at this point to consider the impact of international factors on some of these events. And let's begin with the general election, which led to the first Dáil, which meets on 21st of January 1919, and you can see a picture. I think actually that's technically a picture of the second Dáil. Now let's think about the election which led to this event. It was called immediately after the armistice. So the election which provided the mandate for Dáil Éireann was essentially a wartime event. Its results were delayed until December to allow soldiers' ballots to be counted. The expansion of the UK electorate roughly tripled, from which Sinn Fein benefited, was another wartime event, as was the single issue which was most responsible for Sinn Fein's emergence as a mass movement, which was the anti-conscription campaign of spring 1918. So when we begin to think about the events of 1919 in this context, we can see that as with the Easter 1916 rising, the pressures of the First World War, the international consequences and pressures emerging from that event are driving a lot of the revolutionary agitation which is taking place in Ireland. And this is very much the case for post-war nationalism across much of the world, Central and Eastern Europe, obviously, but also other parts such as much of Asia, for example. We're seeing a kind of what's been described by the historian Erez Manela as a Wilsonian moment. There appears to be a political shift as empires are destroyed across much of Europe or weakened, as in other areas such as the UK, and in which nationalist movements are emboldened by the new political atmosphere and the new embrace of the ideal of self-determination. So let's look at how some of these ideas can be seen to feed. So these are international or global ideas. They relate very much to a kind of a shift of political consciousness, if you like. And I think these are ideas which you can see influencing the 1918 general election and also the opening of Dáil Éireann. So if you look at Sinn Féin's 1918 election manifesto, central to this manifesto is an appeal for a mandate to secure a place for Ireland at the Paris Peace Conference. And if you look at this image here, which is Republican propaganda, imagining after their general election success being welcomed by Uncle Sam, representing America, to the peace table, you can see that England is looking very shifty about that prospect, and the French aren't looking too pleased about it either. And of course, the English and the French are two imperial powers who are very much not enthusiastic about the Wilsonian, President Wilson's idea of self-determination being the political vision of the future. So essentially, in the 1918 general election, Sinn Féin's manifesto really emphasised the importance of global affairs, and Republicans essentially appealed for a mandate at home to place their case for independence before the world. To quote one of the leaflets, "Vote so that President Wilson may have overwhelming proof of Ireland's demand to be free." And again, this is something you see fueling a lot of nationalist mobilization across much of Europe and other parts of the world in the post-war period. And you also see it throughout significant parts of the British Empire, Middle East, Egypt and India, and so on, where nationalists really feel that the wind is in their sails. Now, if you think about this strategy, in one sense, it doesn't really make sense, because the Allies were hardly likely to side against Britain with a movement which had identified itself with its gallant German allies in 1916. So in terms of the realpolitik, there's never any question that America, even had it wanted to, was going to persuade Britain and France to grant Irish independence. It was fairly clear that there was a cynical position taken on self-determination, in which self-determination was intended for the peoples of the defeated Austro-Hungarian and Russian and Ottoman empires, rather than those ruled by the winners. And the winners would come up with their own formulations, such as the idea of mandates and so on, to essentially justify hanging on to their imperial territory while giving away the imperial territory of the losers of the First World War. So that was obviously always going to happen, and many astute Republicans would have felt that likelihood was possible. But if we think about this image here in propaganda terms, though, you can see that Sinn Féin's appeal to a peace conference, which had formally declared its intention to, quote, settle the future of the nations of the world on the principle of government by consent of the government, was a very astute propaganda position to push. Republicans and imperialists alike understood the revolutionary implications of Wilson's 14 points, which was his famous speech released in 1917. And the 14 points essentially heralded what was described as a new world order, which would be determined by the principle of self-determination and international law rather than military might. And indeed, and this is quite important too in understanding why Sinn Féin was so successful, in the weeks prior to the election of 1918, republics had been proclaimed in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. So if you think about Europe before the First World War, republics are pretty rare. I think there's 4 or 5 of them. If you think about Europe after the First World War, there's about 18, 20, 22 of them emerge in a very short couple of years after the war ends. And in fact, such was the impact of the rhetoric of self-determination that even Britain and France, while the war was still on, had felt it necessary to affirm, insincerely of course, that they also believed that governments should derive, quote, their authority from the initiative and free choice of the indigenous population. So even if Republicans have reason to be skeptical that this scenario, which we can see here on the image, is going to unfold, it's certainly good propaganda to emphasize and to remind people and to remind America that the rhetoric of the First World War had made clear that that conflict was a conflict fought for the freedom of small nations. So in short, in demanding independence rather than something less such as home rule, Republicans knew that the tide of history was on their side. And I think that's quite important for us in terms of understanding why their demand for a republic had so much more credibility than the same demand being made prior to the First World War, when Republicans were a very small and marginalized and often mocked minority. So the sense that history was on their side underpinned rising expectations in Ireland. For many voters, Home Rule now seemed the relic of the old pre-war order, and Republicans seemed very much the idea of the moment. Sinn Fein's election leaflets highlighted how its demands had already been achieved by other peoples emerging from the wreckage of empire elsewhere in Europe. So in the image on the left, we can see Poland free, an object lesson for Ireland. Poland is now Sinn Fein. It's a very literal translation of the idea of self-determination as something that's occurring everywhere. Republicans, in fact, believed that Ireland, with its ancient culture and its clearly defined boundaries, as they saw them anyway, had a far stronger case than these new republics. So we can see that, for example, in the election leaflet on the right. The Czechoslovaks are demanding independence. Nobody is quite sure who the Czechoslovaks are, but the whole world knows who the Irish are. In fact, I'm reading from a different leaflet, but you get the idea. Irish nationalists would have felt very confident that the Irish case for independence would have been perceived to be stronger across much of the world than a country who very few people had up to that point heard of, and which had been cobbled together from different ethnic and national groupings. So the establishment of the Dáil on 21st of January 1919 continues this idea of the importance of international events in terms of how Republicans are framing their arguments at home and internationally. And the other thing that's striking when you go back to look at the Dáil in January 1919, without the hindsight of the military aspect of the War of Independence, which actually begins on the same day with the shootings in Soloheadbeg. In hindsight, when you go back to this period, it's very clear that a lot of Republicans assumed that politics would prove more important than violence in achieving independence. So, for example, we find Arthur Griffith writing from Gloucester Prison 2 days after the general election victory. Above all, concentrate on the peace conference, he argues. And if we look at what takes place on the opening meeting of the Dáil on the 21st of January 1919, we can see that each of the iconic documents which are proclaimed at that first meeting, the Declaration of Independence, which you can see on the left, the message to the free nations of the world, which you can see on the right, and also even the democratic program. Each of these documents was written to appeal to an international as much as to a domestic audience. So the message to the free nations of the world was very much a call for international support. But the Declaration of Independence, of course, is the way in which nations, for 2 centuries, going back to 1776, that was the way in which nations made their case for independence. They proclaimed it internationally to the world. And even the democratic program, which on the face of it seems to be really about a set of progressive social policies by which Ireland would be governed, that was also framed in terms of persuading the international left to support the Irish case for an important socialist conference which was taking place around that time. If we look at the wording of the Declaration of Independence, we can see that it demands, quote, the recognition and support of every free nation in the world. If we look at the document on the left, on the right, the message to the free nations, it calls, quote, upon every free nation to support the Irish Republic by recognising Ireland's national status and her rights to its vindication at the Peace Conference. So the Dáil's message to the free nations of the world was directly addressed to the international community. And indeed, if we go back to our list of the major events which we are currently commemorating as part of the War of Independence, we can see that quite a lot of them had significant global dimensions. So De Valera, for example, spent most of his term, I think about 19 months of his term, as president during the War of Independence in America. But he was not, as is described by the expert advisory group, he was not actually elected president of Ireland on 1st of April 1919. Rather, on that date, he was elected president of the Dáil ministry. The much more impressive title, President of Ireland, was something which was invented for propaganda reasons by his Irish American supporters to add luster to his American tour, which was tremendously successful. He packed arenas and stadiums such as Wrigley Field across the country. He raised vast amounts of funds, I think about $5.5 million, even not if not all of it got home. And perhaps most importantly, he focused global attention on Ireland and on the Irish question during this tour. And if we think about De Valera's tour in the US, it really points us to the importance of America as a place in terms of it's the political effectiveness of the Irish Republican campaign or demand for independence. And we can see also through his elevation to a new title, which was not rooted in the Dáil itself. We can also see how we can imagine some of the political consequences which are coming from his external profile as a kind of a global statesman. So it's in general, it's a very useful thing for Irish Republicans, but we can also see political tensions emerging from the stature and the political power which accrues to De Valera as a result of his global profile in the United States during this period. And again, this is something we can see with other nationalist movements elsewhere, where the diasporic aspects of the movement can become very, very influential. Moving on to another event to be commemorated, Terence McSweeney's death. Obviously, that was felt very keenly in Ireland, but it was the worldwide sympathy for Sinn Fein which resulted from global press coverage of his hunger strike, which probably proved the really pivotal aspect of that key event in terms of the impact on how the War of Independence is understood more broadly. And it's hard to overestimate the extent to which McSweeney becomes a global icon around much of the world. It becomes it becomes a defining event in terms of how many people abroad would have perceived the Irish issue, and of course would have sympathised in terms of the motivations and the sacrifice of Irish Republicans at that time. Similarly, if we think about events like Bloody Sunday or the burning of Cork, the reason why these infamous reprisals were so counterproductive, or at least an important reason why they were so counterproductive, was as much for their international as their domestic consequences. The condemnation of reprisals by conservative as well as liberal newspapers in Britain and America undermined David Lloyd George's Irish policy. It undermined his government's resolve to sustain its counter-insurrectionary campaign in Ireland, despite the fact that it was achieving increasing successes in the final months of the conflict. And in particular, it was British awareness that it was losing the propaganda war internationally, and particularly the United States, which explains the British government's humiliating decision to negotiate with a group of people that it had only recently condemned as a murder gang. So as I end this first part of the talk, just to clarify the argument that I'm making, I don't want to suggest that what Irish nationalists did in Ireland wasn't crucial in achieving independence. But I do want to argue that much of the importance of what they did in Ireland stemmed from how their actions were publicised and perceived beyond the island. And in fact, you could make the case that Irish Republicans demonstrated a lot of ingenuity and agency in their very sophisticated efforts to project their conflict on the global stage through the functioning of the Dáil, through revolutionary diplomacy, and through propaganda. And I would argue that perhaps the most distinctive, the most formidable and original aspect of the Irish revolutionary struggle for independence compared to previous movements, and indeed compared to other revolutionary movements at that time, was the way in which it combined the political, the propaganda, along with the military. And in many respects, it creates a template which is quite closely followed by a lot of other revolutionary movements in the later 20th century as they come to fight for their independence. And another point worth noting in terms of the importance of how things were perceived from abroad is that the Irish Republican leadership was, of course, very much aware of this. Michael Collins, for example, advises the Dáil's representative in Rome. Real progress is much more to be estimated by what is thought abroad than by what is thought at home. So that's quite a sophisticated strategy, and we find someone such as the Commander-in-Chief in Ireland of British Forces, General Neville Macready, largely agreeing with this analysis. And Macready complains that this propaganda business is the strongest weapon Sinn Fein has. And of course, coverage of events such as atrocities such as Bloody Sunday exemplified just how counterproductive the British violence in Ireland was becoming by late 1920, even if in military terms it was achieving some successes in terms of placing Republicans under increasing pressure. So at this point, I just want to shift to the second. Should have come to these pictures earlier. We can see again the Terence McSweeney's hunger strike in ways that are rather similar to Bobby Sands in 1981 becomes a global story of significance. So at this point, I want to move to the second part of this talk, which is just to relatively briefly compare Amritsar and Bloody Sunday. How do these two events compare? And I want to begin with the differences, as I think in many respects the differences are more important. And without minimizing the horrors of Bloody Sunday or how this particular event impacted on the families of the victims of Bloody Sunday, which I think was really movingly conveyed over the weekend in terms of the commemoration ceremony we saw at Croke Park, but also the very fine historical documentary about Bloody Sunday. But without minimizing the impact of Bloody Sunday at the time, the really significant difference between these two events is obviously the scale of violence. At least 400 people are thought to have been killed by the British Indian Army in India. It may have been more, whereas the number of fatalities in Croke Park was 14. And I suppose this raises one obvious question, which was, why was British violence more constrained in Ireland than in India? And we have all sorts of statistics that we can look at to compare levels of fatalities and levels of casualties and so on, and the differences are very stark. I think we can identify some obvious factors, and I think race was one of these factors. Types of violence, also types of humiliation, but types of violence and also scales of violence could be inflicted on non-white people in places like India or Egypt or the Middle East that were simply not considered acceptable, or certainly politically acceptable, within the United Kingdom, even in the Irish part of the United Kingdom, where coercion had long been deployed without the same kind of legal and cultural constraints that operated in the rest of Great Britain. And you find in denouncing British violence in Ireland in 1920, even progressive, leftist, um, and religious British organisations who emphasise the status of the Irish as a white and Christian people who share racial ties with the British, in making the case that the kind of violence that's taking place in Ireland isn't acceptable. So there's there's an implication here that these types of violence are less egregious when they're taking place elsewhere. And racial considerations also strengthened Ireland's claim to independence, particularly with the other white dominions who become quite influential in the framing of the treaty and peace settlement in 1921. But you even find leaders such as Eamon de Valera, who cultivated close and genuine connections with Indian nationalists. You also find de Valera saying things like, "Why are we the last white people to be denied self-determination?" So race is a card which can be played by nationalists as well as by imperialists, depending on the context. But perhaps as important, maybe even more important, as the racist character of imperialism was Ireland's proximity to Britain. Small-scale British violence in Ireland, as Maurice Walsh has noted in his excellent study of press coverage of the Irish War of Independence, attracted far more attention than large-scale British violence in more distant imperial locations. During much of 1920, when outrages such as Bloody Sunday received immense publicity, the bombing of villages in Mesopotamia, for example, by the RAF went largely unrecorded by the British press. When news of imperial reprisals did reach Britain, it was often out of date, lessening its impact. In the case of Amritsar, for example, a combination of distance and censorship meant that it took 8 months for the first accurate accounts of the slaughter which had occurred to reach the British public. And importantly, by that point, a misleading narrative of what had happened and why it had happened had already been established by newspaper coverage of bland official telegrams presenting the official account of what had happened. The British were responding to disturbances. I think another important difference was that Ireland was not a colony. It formed a part of the United Kingdom state. Ireland had a relatively free press. It elected MPs who sat at Westminster and could contribute to debates. And crucially, a crucial difference is that Ireland contributed to and benefited from the British Empire. So the general responsible for the massacre at Amritsar, for example, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, had Irish connections. He wasn't an Irish by birth, but he was educated at Middleton College in Cork, and he studied medicine at the Royal College of Surgeons. Sir Michael O'Dwyer, the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab, who you can see in the image on the right, who supported Dyer's actions before and after the massacre, was an Irish-born Catholic from County Tipperary, and he was later assassinated, as you can see from the headline there, in London by an Indian nationalist, Udham Singh. Another difference was the official acknowledgement of British wrongdoing in relation to Amritsar. The sheer scale of the massacre, when it finally became known, prompted intense debate in Britain, which focused on responsibility for what was widely accepted to be an unjustifiable atrocity. And relatively quickly, the report of the Hunter Commission, which was published in 1920, placed much of the blame on General Dyer and on the government of the Punjab. And although Dyer certainly had his supporters amongst British imperialists in Britain and wasn't tried for murder, he was widely criticised in the House of Commons, and his military career was ended when he was turned down for a promotion. Whereas in contrast to the Hunter report, the official inquiries into the Croke Park shootings, which focused on who fired the first shots, were not made public. Statements were taken in camera. Key findings were only released by the British Public Office as recently as 2002. And while some of these findings, that the firing on the crowd by the RIC auxiliary forces was carried out without orders and was indiscriminate and unjustifiable and exceeded the demands of the situation, while some of these findings reflected poorly on the army, the effect of the most publicised finding that Republicans had allegedly shot first was to exonerate Crown forces from much of the responsibility for the carnage which had proceeded. So I've spent quite a bit of time looking at differences between the two events because I think they're very important. We're looking at an event of a very different scale in quite a different political context. But I think the similarities and the connections between both events are also important and worth reflecting upon. Perhaps the most important similarity is how both events are widely regarded, not just in Ireland or India, but globally as unjustifiable atrocities which were seen to legitimise nationalist demands for independence. Even prior to Bloody Sunday, De Valera had frequently condemned British violence in India when he spoke at public meetings in the United States. And it's particularly in the US that we find Irish and Irish Americans making common cause with anti-colonial activists, in particular from India and Egypt. And India, Egypt and Ireland are three countries that are again and again placed in the same context in political discussions and propaganda in America. And I think partly this placing of the Irish alongside the Indian and the Egyptian cause is partly due to genuine solidarity between revolutionaries who are working together, and they form organisations such as the anti-imperialist leagues and so on. But it's also because of the shared propaganda benefits of framing British rule as an imperialist denial of the right to self-determination proclaimed by President Wilson. So it's a very effective argument to make, particularly in the United States, where there's a broader antipathy or hostility to imperialism, where imperialism as a kind of a political philosophy is largely discredited. Now, just as anti-imperialists such as De Valera, and you can see from Kate O'Malley's study on the right-hand side that he retained strong links with Indian nationalists for many decades, and in fact, many African and Asian anti-colonial activists would look towards Ireland in the 30s and 40s onwards as a kind of a successful example of how to win political independence. So just as there were solidarities cultivated between anti-imperialists, you also see that imperialists develop similar connections and linkages between these different arenas of imperial conflict. So Sir Henry Wilson, for example, an Irishman, but better known as the chief of the Imperial General Staff and Britain's top soldier, therefore, Wilson linked the domestic challenge from Irish Republicans with Labour unrest in Britain, with international Bolshevism as a result of the Russian Revolution, and with global anti-colonial agitation. Britain, Henry Wilson noted, is fighting New York and Cairo and Calcutta and Moscow, who are only using Ireland as a tool and a lever against England, and nothing but determined shooting on our part is any use. Although imperial violence generated little publicity in Britain, the more extensive coverage of British violence in Ireland condensed anxieties, to quote one historian, about Britain's imperial position as no other country could. So in other words, British coverage of the campaign in Ireland, and this is a point which is very well developed by Maurice Walsh, British coverage of the campaign in Ireland exposed to the British public view tactics of colonial repression which were normally concealed by distance, ignorance or indifference, as Walsh notes. So this is a Ireland is essentially making the violence of imperialism much more visible than it has previously been to a British public. And again, a lot of this is simply because of proximity. Journalists could cross to Ireland overnight and see, for example, the centre of Balbriggan burned down. And that's interestingly the first really big reprisal that generates huge coverage in Britain. And I think it's that idea of it's something that's happening so close. So acknowledgements of parallels between imperial violence in far-flung places like India and parts of the United Kingdom, such as Ireland, I think had contradictory effects. For imperialists, it highlighted how compromise in Ireland could threaten the fabric of the entire empire. Again, to quote General Wilson, is a good weather vane for a kind of unreconstructed imperialist diehard. As General Wilson puts it, if we lose Ireland, we have lost the empire. So concerns about India make it actually more difficult to make concessions about Ireland. Make the concerns about India make it all the more important to show no mercy in terms of suppressing the Irish revolution, because bigger prizes are at stake. And I think this belief that what happens in Ireland will reverberate throughout the British Empire, shape British decision making in terms of, firstly, how the war should be conducted with quite a degree of ruthlessness, but then also somewhat counterintuitively how the war should then be settled in terms of a political accommodation, because the violence in Ireland was proving just so damaging. So on the one hand, violence, the imperial perceived imperial importance of Ireland could justify a lack of compromise. On the other hand, growing public opposition in Britain to violence in Ireland represented a threat to the British Empire at the very time when British politicians are trying to reconfigure the empire as an international commonwealth of liberal democratic nations. Equally problematically, as Edward Madigan has recently explored in a fascinating article in Irish Historical Studies, British violence in Ireland peaked at exactly the same time, November 1920, 100 years ago this month, that British commemoration of the First World War, with the unveiling of the cenotaph and the tomb of the unknown soldier, was dominating public consciousness in Britain. So we often think of these conflicts as very different, the First World War and what's happening in Ireland, but actually what was happening in Ireland was dominating the press coverage at precisely the same time as public mourning of the First World War was dominating the newspapers and public consciousness also. And Edward Madigan argues that this dissonance between the memory of the First World War as a war for civilization and a war for freedom and for justice, and the news of British terror in Ireland, which was seeing British policy widely condemned, not just by the left, but by right-wing journalists, by politicians, by church leaders, that this dissonance was an important part of the undermining of British government policy in Ireland. In other words, that the knowledge that things were being done in Ireland, such as Bloody Sunday, was seen by many people who had lost loved ones in the First World War as tarnishing their memory and the cause in which they had died for. And you find that idea is very powerfully articulated in the House of Lords, for example, by particular British politicians, such as the former Liberal Prime Minister Asquith, and also leading Anglican bishops, who are very outspoken in criticising British government policy. So I guess to try and sort of begin pulling things together, the argument I'm making is that it's not really possible to understand British policy on Ireland without appreciating how perceptions of Ireland, and also how decision making on Ireland, were linked to wider imperial concerns, and that includes politicians and the army, but also public opinion too. It is a democracy. Britain's crisis of empire, which spanned the Middle East and India, limited the manpower and the resources and the political capital that could be expended on Ireland in 1920 and 1921. One reason, for example, why Winston Churchill made the fateful decision to form the Black and Tans was his and the cabinet's concerns about the military resources that they would require to suppress unrest in India and Egypt. So that fateful decision to raise this cut price, hasty paramilitary force leads us directly to the events that took place in Croke Park 100 years ago. And of course, the repercussions of Bloody Sunday were central to the discrediting of Britain's Irish policy in Ireland, in Britain, and also globally. So in other words, wider imperial considerations were central to the conduct of the conflict, and also how that conflict comes to an end in 1921. In particular, pressure from the US and the British Empire contributed to London's decision to concede an Irish dominion. And if you look at this settlement in terms of the other settlements that Britain is making in 1921, which range from Egypt to Palestine, you can see that all of these settlements are intended to restore political stability to a deeply troubled empire in 1921. And the primary rationale between these new forms of statehood, even though they differ, a dominion in Ireland, mandates elsewhere, but the primary rationale behind these new forms of statehood devised by London is essentially to contain nationalist demands within a reconfigured imperial framework rather than to satisfy local democratic aspirations. So I think when people were sitting down and thinking about the importance of Ireland and framing an Irish settlement, one, that settlement had to be an imperial settlement, but two, I think they were also thinking in terms of, with these changes, the empire marching on for decades more. I don't think it was seen as an end game, as a way of sort of slowly withdrawing out of Ireland. I think it was seen as a way of reconfiguring empire so that it could remain in place for many more decades. So I just want to end this talk by noting one final connection between both events, and that is their unresolved legacy in Britain rather than Ireland. I think we often think a lot, we do quite a little bit of hand-wringing about how we Irish remember and commemorate and revise our history, but I think it's also important to look at the other side of those who were involved in this particular event. In his speech on Bloody Sunday, President O'Higgins spoke of the need to find the courage to remember painful events with honesty, and I think that's something that should also apply to the British state in terms of reflecting on these events 100 years on. However, given the decision of the British government's First World War Centenary Advisory Board, which a decision that was made a couple of years ago, against the advice of its historical advisors, not to extend the UK's commemorative programme to encompass post-war violence in Ireland and in India, it seems an unlikely prospect that there will be much remembering within Britain of the events which profoundly shaped not just modern Ireland, but also the modern UK state. When Queen Elizabeth visited Croke Park, she extended, in a welcome gesture, deep sympathy to all who have suffered as a consequence of our troubled past, but she stopped short of a formal apology. In 2019, Theresa May followed previous British Prime Ministers by expressing deep regret about the massacre in Amritsar, but not formally apologising for it. English forgetfulness of Ireland, of Irish violence, and also of the realities of empire and imperial violence are not a new phenomena. But with the centenary of partition approaching and the re-emergence of the Irish border as a destabilising issue, it should be hoped that public and political engagement with the legacy of political violence in Ireland will not be confined to one side of the Irish Sea. Thanks.